Hello, welcome back. Happy New Year. It's about to be 2026. 5 years ago, I wrote an article on my website about a New Year's resolution for 2021, specifically things that the Army could do to be more effective at mountain warfare. It's been about 5 years, so let's go through it and we'll see if I still agree with my list, if the Army actually did any of these things. You're welcome to read the original article on mountainmaneuverist.com, but I know most of you refuse to read, so I'll read the highlights to you to make it easier. The first thing right off the bat is I speak about why mountainous regions are important globally and why we should be able to fight in them and for them. And the first thing was water. So in the article I say, mountains make up about 25% of the Earth's surface and are home to 600 million people, and an estimated 3 billion people of 8 billion globally rely on mountains for fresh water to drink, grow food, generate power, and sustain industries. It's estimated that by 2025, which is now, 2/3 of the world's population could face water shortages. Mountains and rivers often form boundaries between regions and countries. This can cause battles to secure water at its source. Reference the ongoing conflict in the Himalayas between India, China, and Pakistan. So I tried to take a deep dive into this, and I found endless sources of how scarce fresh water is becoming globally. People could get PhDs in this topic, and I'm sure they do, but a couple of recent news articles really put things in perspective to me. The first one is that Iran is seriously considering moving its capital from Tehran due to a severe water shortage and its expanding population. Now, Tehran has pretty big mountains that overlook it from the north, and it also gets some pretty decent snow in the winter, so the fact that the population has expanded so rapidly that they may now have to move the capital, to me, is pretty shocking. And they're also looking to move it to a southern region, which is near the coast. And it seems like their plan is to desalinate ocean water, like a couple other of the Middle Eastern countries do. So if this happened to a country that was landlocked, this would be an even bigger problem than it already is. The next news story is that Mexico actually owes the United States 570 billion gallons of water every 5 years. And in this 5-year cycle, they shorted the US 260 billion gallons of water. The US threatened more tariffs on Mexico, and Mexico is in the middle of slowly releasing all that water that they owe. Again, you could do a deep dive into the 1944 water treaty, but personally it was surprising that this was even going on. And the third news story is actually about AI, saying that in 2025 the AI industry used as much water as the bottled water industry combined, which blew my mind. They use fresh water to cool servers, and in some cases they take directly from drinking water sources. So even in just the last year or two, there's been an explosion of AI, and people are talking about how the AI is the future, not only of the civilian sector, but in military strategy. And believe it or not, it's all coming back to water. So now going back to my article, I talk about transportation and protection. I say, as mentioned above, mountains form natural borders, and mountains channelize most people and goods into taking specific routes through an area or border crossing. And no amount of time or technology is going to change that. In order to ensure free passage and free trade, mountain borders need to be safe and secure. Then I talk about protection. I say Switzerland knows this. The mountains provide protection from an invading force while also providing everything needed to sustain living. This can work both ways, as we've seen in the last 20 years that mountains can give safe haven for people who want to do bad things, and I'm referencing in this Afghanistan. So I think these are both pretty straightforward and haven't changed much in the last 5 years. However, we do have an example of a modern conflict with drones, AI, and two near-peer forces fighting it out in the mountains, and that is the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And since I wrote this article, there has been an offensive by Azerbaijan in 2023 to cut off Armenia from the contested Nagorno-Karabakh region inside Azerbaijan. So this is a mountainous region that was connected to Armenia via the Lakan Corridor, and this was taken control of by Azerbaijan. The Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh were cut off from gas, electricity, and internet, and the mountainous environment channeled all that movement into and out of the region to a few easily blocked roads. After an offensive that lasted just a few days, peace talks began, and the Lakan Corridor was opened for one-way travel to allow Armenians to leave the region. Around 100,000 Armenians left, and within weeks, Azerbaijan had complete control of the area. Azerbaijan's control of the mountainous route is one of the aspects that forced Armenia's hand into the ceasefire. So zooming out and looking at the big picture, a mountaintop is never going to be the main military objective versus major urban areas. But control of mountainous regions at times could give one side such a significant advantage that the other side has no way to counter this. So that's the big picture. Let's zoom in a little bit and talk about the individual mountain soldiers. Mobility really is the key problem that we're trying to solve by having specialized mountain soldiers. In the article I write, there's something that can relieve the stress of a soldier's muscles and joints while helping them move faster and farther and increasing their longevity as a soldier. It never runs out of battery. I'm not referencing a multi-million-dollar exoskeleton being developed by defense contractors. I'm talking about a $100 set of trekking poles. So trekking poles provide stability and support while walking, can give you a third or fourth point of contact on slopes, can overall take some of the weight off of a soldier's legs and distribute them to their arms. In addition to saving the body some wear and tear, they help with stability in steep and uneven terrain. They help soldiers with mobility, which is arguably one of the most important aspects of mountain warfare. The Army does field some already, but there seems to be a stigma against using them because they don't look tactical and you don't have both your hands on your weapon. If it's a concern, you could just use one for your weak hand or store them if you want both hands available. Get rid of the stigma. Mountaineers use trekking poles. I can tell you that since writing this, the units that I've been in have gotten a lot better at this. We used to get issued these really long white ski poles that basically look like they were from World War II, and they probably were. But within the last couple of years, our infantry units were issued modern, quality ski poles that actually adjust. And you don't have to use them all the time or throughout a whole movement. You can alter your movement techniques based on the probability of contact. For example, we use different spacing between people and groups of people when patrolling based on the probability of contact. So traveling spacing is when contact is unlikely. So maybe that's when you can have both ski poles out and your weapon slung to the side of your back. And then when contact becomes a little bit more possible or probable, you switch to traveling overwatch, right? So spacing between people and groups of people get a little bit bigger. So maybe you collapse one ski pole and put it away so that way you have a better handle on your rifle. And then when contact becomes likely, maybe you switch to bounding overwatch. So instead of entire groups of people moving at the same time, you have one group moving while the other is stationary and keeping watch. And so maybe for that you store both of the ski poles, or you keep one out depending on the environment. They can give you additional height like a bipod or monopod to help you shoot over snow. There's some really good techniques for that, and I can go over that in the future. So the next thing I talk about in my article is skiing. I say there's a lot of debate about whether or not conventional mountain infantry even needs to ski. The argument about skiing is that it's too hard to teach people who have never done it before. Recently, the Army chose to test short, fat skis and bindings that fit over different types of boots that soldiers are already issued. These skis bridge the gap between the less efficient snowshoe and a full-fledged alpine touring ski, and they're a great mobility tool and a step in the right direction for people who have never skied before. However, in an ideal world, mountain soldiers would have the time and the training to properly learn how to ski on an alpine touring setup. The Army has gone full send on programs recently, like implementing the ACFT and the 7-day weapons qualification. So can the Army go full send on their ski program for the few units that should actually be using them? All right, so the ACFT mention kind of dates this article a little bit. So since writing this article, I know that the Vermont and Colorado Guard has issued units skis with pin bindings. I believe that active duty is still stuck with those same short, fat skis. I think that shows one of the pros to the Guard having some autonomy and getting to spend money how they see fit. I know I personally helped teach some ski basics to one of these infantry companies a few years ago. And then last year, they actually spent a drill going up and over Mount Mansfield and then skiing down Stowe. I think that was a bold move, but it actually demonstrated to the soldiers a couple things. First, there's no way they could have moved on that terrain on foot. Secondly, skis were way faster than trying to do that on snowshoes. And third, skiing is going to be made a priority, so it's in your best interest to actually learn how to ski. And, I've seen active duty 10th Mountain guys at local ski races, and they do have some really great skiers who are also cardio machines. So I have no doubt that given the right equipment and time to train, they would produce a group of really effective ski soldiers. The question is, how many skiers do you need per company or battalion? And when do you have diminishing returns with how much time you spend on skiing versus all the other parts of being a soldier? I think that's another topic that deserves its own full-length discussion. So the next thing I talk about in the article is overwhites. I say multicam alpine, Marine Corps snow camo, and overwhites. We have 3 patterns to choose from. Can we pick one and just put it on the inside of reversible cold weather clothing? The current system of wearing them over your uniform is so cumbersome that they are often left behind. Between long-range observations that are possible in the mountains and the threat of unmanned aerial systems being able to remain unseen in the mountain environment can increase the survivability of these soldiers. Yeah, so when we did the Edelweiss raid a couple years ago, we were the only country not to wear any type of snow camouflage, which was pretty amusing because, like I said, we have 3 different types of snow camouflage and they're all usable, but for some reason as an army we tend not to use them. A lot of European armies do have that reversible uniform, which is pretty cool, but I know it could cost a lot of money versus overwhites. What I would really like to see more than overwhites would be some sort of thermal tarp or poncho with snow camouflage on one side and maybe green or woodland on the other side. I think at this point overhead camouflage is a little bit more important than uniform camouflage. I think it's just another one of those inexpensive, quick things we can do to greatly improve survivability of the people on the ground. All right, let's change gears from camouflage and start to talk about weapons. So I talk about the intermediate rifle cartridge, and I say a widely accepted fact is that fighting in the mountains tends to happen at longer ranges than in flat, wooded, or urban terrain. And then I say it is argued that the standard issued 5.56 M4 is only truly effective 200 meters and closer. Now, I am taking that information from a paper called Increasing Small Arms Lethality in Afghanistan, Taking Back the Infantry Half Kilometer. And that's written by Major Thomas Earnhardt. So I go on to say, this does not inspire confidence in soldiers who are in an area where they can routinely be spotted and fired on from 400 to 500 meters away. Switching some or all of the 5.56 M4s for an intermediate caliber, such as the more efficient 6.5 Grendel, could increase the range out to 800 meters. This is a quick and relatively inexpensive fix because the round can use the same lower receiver and magazines. The 6.5 Grendel is an efficient round that is similar in size and weight to the 5.56, but has a similar trajectory and ballistics to the larger 7.62 NATO that our medium machine guns use. In fact, we can modify those to use 6.5 Grendel, and then we can all carry the same ammunition. There is currently an evaluation for the Army's new rifle chambered in 6.8 millimeter for next-gen squad weapon, NGSW. The 6.8 millimeter will extend the range of the rifleman, but that could take years to field. A 6.5 Grendel upper is a quick and easy fix in the meantime. Okay, so when I wrote this, we were still in Afghanistan, so the assumption was that we needed a quick and easy fix. Given some time and space in between, the 6.8 is starting to come out now, and this is becoming a very contentious topic. But they always say when offering solutions to give 3 options. So the conservative option would be something like keeping the M4 and developing a higher pressure 5.56 round. If you didn't know, 5.56 NATO is also known as the M855 green tip and the M855A1, which has a steel penetrator, and they both have a grain weight of 62 grains, so that's the weight of the actual bullet itself. In the civilian market, shooters have been going all the way up to 77 grain bullets for more consistency and slightly more energy on target in exchange for some increased but predictable bullet drop. But there's only so much you could be doing with the legacy M4 system and the 5.56 round. You'd probably have to replace most of the upper receivers anyway if you want a higher pressure round, so let's put a pin in that. So 5 years on, 6.5 Grendel would still be my middle of the road option. You could keep the same lower receiver. It's a heavier bullet that retains power at distance and is less affected by wind. And for reference, the 6.5 Grendel is usually between 90 and 130 grains as far as how heavy the bullet weighs. So basically double the bullet weight of a 5.56. What are the cons? Well, the casing is bigger, so although I originally said it'd fit in a standard 5.56 magazine, you'd really need a dedicated magazine for the 6.5 Grendel for them to be reliable. And those magazines are going to hold less rounds, usually 25 rounds. Also, the lower receiver and the magazines aren't the expensive part of the rifle anyway. It's the upper receiver that costs more, so we're really not saving that much money by taking this half measure. So if we're losing some capacity anyway, we could go with a slightly larger bullet like the 6.8 by 51, For reference, the bullet grain weights are 125 to 155 grains, and the rifle itself is a little bit heavier. So I could easily be convinced that the 6.8 round and the new M7 rifles are the right way to go, specifically for mountain soldiers who would actually benefit from the additional range that the 6.8 can provide. But I think that's a longer discussion for a different time. The next thing I talk about is LVPOs and the training that goes with it. I say while we're replacing the upper receivers, we might as well put a low power variable optic on it. LVPO for short. They're becoming more popular for civilians. I think they really belong in the mountains. If a mountain soldier is given a round that could shoot 800 meters, they better be able to see 800 meters and be able to identify what they're looking at. The Army has already contracted SIG Sauer to make the DVO, direct viewing optic. So let's issue them to mountain units first. So since I wrote this, some units have been issued the DVO, also known as the SIG Tango 6T. If you didn't know, it's a 1:6 power first focal plane optic with a bullet drop compensator. I think it's pretty good at replacing the ACOG, which is a fixed 4 power, so you can dial back down to 1 power with the DVO and then up to 6 power. So a little bit more than the ACOG, and it also has some windage references that the ACOG does not. I think it's actually a good general purpose combat optic that could both extend the range of a shooter versus an ACOG, but also make shooting up close easier by being able to reduce it to 1 power for close quarters combat. Because to me, the biggest downside of the ACOG was trying to use it in close quarters. One specific training that comes to mind was a live fire we did at Fort Drum, moving house to house down a cul-de-sac. It was a little difficult to aim and shoot quickly at room distances with a fixed sight that's fixed at 4 times magnification. And on top of that, trying to aim and shoot with your non-dominant side was even harder. That's switching which shoulder the rifle's on. Now you're squeezing the trigger with your non-dominant hand and aiming with your non-dominant eye through an already difficult optic to aim up close. So I like the idea of having the option to lower the power down to 1x up close. What is becoming more and more prevalent for civilians and competition shooters is actually mounting a red dot sight on top of the scope for closer range targets. And that also gives you the ability to aim passively through night vision, which as a former scout, I like the idea of not putting a laser light show on for everybody every time I aim. I have shot the M110A1 with a Tango 6T scope on it, and it seems pretty simple and useful, and I think it's a big improvement over the ACOG. Now let's move on to the newest optic that's supposed to be issued with the next generation squad weapon, and that's the Vortex Optics XM157. It's a 1:8 first focal plane active reticle with a laser rangefinder on the top that also acts as a ballistic calculator, and that's going to superimpose the calculated aim point into the glass when you look through the scope. This laser rangefinder also replaces any laser aiming module that would be on the front of your gun, so the whole system is heavier than the SIG Tango 6T, but that's not exactly a fair comparison because it's replacing 2 pieces of equipment, not just one. But I think it still makes things a little bit more complicated than it needs to be, and it's biasing the long-range precision shooting aspect of the rifle. The reticle is in mils, so if you don't want to use the laser rangefinder, you actually do have to do a little bit more math to aim at targets if your laser rangefinder goes down, or you don't want to emit that laser and give up your position. Versus the SIG Tango 6T, you just range with the reticle, and your reticle should already be on that target. I personally think that soldiers could be just as effective with the Tango 6T given the proper training. Also, having that laser sit on top of the optic removes the possibility of putting a red dot up there and being able to passively aim. You could put the red dot on a 45-degree angle, but I'm not a fan of that for a few reasons, and that could be a different discussion. The other thing is when you're holding your rifle at the low ready position and looking over your optic, it looks like that laser's like perfectly in your way. So you'd have to lower the rifle even more to be able to look over the optic. So overall, I'm more of a fan of the Tango 6T and not so much the XM157 for general issue. The next thing I talk about is the Arctic tent. So currently the standard winter tent for our mountain soldiers is the big, heavy 10-man Arctic tent. It weighs around 56 pounds, and the stove that is typically coupled with the Arctic space heater weighs another 50 pounds, and then that gets packed into a sled that weighs 40 pounds by itself, and then along with fuel and water, the sleds can weigh over 200 pounds. For flat Arctic conditions, the system might be adequate, but in the mountains, that really kills our mobility. So yeah, I still agree with that The 10-man Arctic tent are great for survival and camping, but I don't think they're too practical for combat operations, in my opinion. I'd like to see squads dispersed more and be made into smaller targets for things like artillery and drones. I think smaller and lighter tents and heaters would be ideal. That would lead to smaller and lighter sleds needing to be pulled by troops, and it wouldn't take 4 to 5 people to pull one sled. And again, maybe something reversible between snow camo and woodland. I have seen the extreme cold weather tent online made by Eureka, but I've never seen it in person, and it looks like Eureka is now out of business. It looks like it's a solid 4-person, 4-season tent, listed at about 30 pounds. But really any expedition-style tent would do. There's civilian versions that are even lighter. It seems like it would be a good alternative to a big 10-man Arctic tent that weighs 50 pounds, plus the stove, plus the fuel. And the issue isn't so much the overall weight, but how difficult it is to distribute the weight between soldiers. Potentially you could split that smaller tent into more manageable pieces and distribute it throughout the group. Like one person carries the tent itself, the other carries the poles, and the third person carries the rainfly. Potentially you wouldn't even need to drag a sled behind you, or your sled would be a lot smaller. And then you could pack more sustainment items and maybe stay out for longer. I think the big Arctic tents have their place in garrison, but our choices shouldn't be between either dragging a 200-pound sled behind us or sleeping exposed in the snow trench, and that's why I'd like to see some sort of middle ground tent be issued. So the next thing I mentioned in the article is skills and interest-based recruiting. I say currently there are no skills or interest requirements to be in a mountain unit. Mountaineering is one of those activities that if you have no interest in, you're not going to be good at. And if we recruit people that already know how to ski, we could spend less time doing ski instructions and more time using them as a mode of transportation. If we had recruits that don't know how to drive a car, would we make them drivers in a mechanized unit? And the joke is that I'm sure that we do actually do that. If the ranks of mountain infantry units are filled with people who don't care about mountaineering, then it's just another infantry unit, right? We should be recruiting mountaineers and outdoorsmen and women from across the country, what few we have left, and make it worth their time to be in the military. How do we do that? If being mountaineering was a separate job in the military, right, we could give those soldiers more time to focus on their mountaineering skills. So many young people fantasize about becoming fighter pilots because there's that whole aura about them being highly trained and highly skilled professionals and doing a dangerous job. And I ask, is that more dangerous than ice climbing or skiing, potentially hazardous terrain? Right? Leading people through the mountains is a skill that needs refinement and practice. You could ask any AMGA guide. Making a separate MOS could drive home the point that they need to be proficient in the mountains. We should be mandating that mountaineers get time to get their ski hours and climb hours in, just like pilots need their flight hours to ensure that their skills are current. Is this something that could be done in 2021? So fast forward to present time, I think this has been a mixed bag. I think there's been some realization that mountains are a specialty, not just an environment. In 2023, the Army changed the 25th Infantry Division in Alaska to the 11th Airborne Arctic Division. I think that was a step in the right direction. They got rid of their Strykers and got Cat Vs, or cold weather all-terrain vehicles, which are much better suited for the cold and snow. So in that case, I think they put the right equipment in the right environment. I think personally I'd like to see something similar happen to the 10th Mountain Division, possibly put somewhere where they can more easily train in the mountains at altitude, like Fort Carson, or reestablish Camp Hale. I know there's a group of soldiers at Fort Drum that do get out there and train hard on their own time, but the Adirondacks are a few hours away for them. I know they're doing the best they can with what they have. At least Fort Drum does get cold and gets a lot of snow, even though it's flat. But right now, 10th Mountain's 3rd Brigade is in Fort Polk, Louisiana, and helps with pre-deployment training at the Joint Readiness Training Center. So you have one of your 3 supposed mountain infantry brigades in the swamps of Louisiana, where it doesn't even get cold in the winter. It's definitely an important mission going on down there, but I think that a mountain brigade should be doing things in the mountains. Maybe that's who you would put at Fort Carson or Camp Hale as a test to see just how good you can get an active duty infantry brigade filled with motivated mountaineers, and then go from there. Of course, this is all pie in the sky stuff, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't say it out loud. All right, let's move on to my last point. I say that the number one thing the Army can do to become more capable in the mountains is to get out there and train at the lowest level. Too many soldiers attend mountain warfare school but then never use the skills they learned when they get back to their units. Those soldiers should be sharing their skills any chance they can, and the people in charge should be fostering these opportunities. If you're looking for guidance or support, reach out. After all, mountaineering is a community. Okay, so 5 years on, I think a lot has happened to increase the mountain culture. Social media, apparel, ski races, podcasts, and I think just the overall buy-in since the end of the global war on terror. I think that 10, 15 years ago, company commanders, battalion commanders, and higher were focused on the GWOT, and rightfully so, because that's what was going on at the time. But now we have the prospect of Russia moving westward, China moving eastward, and soldiers at the lowest level realizing that we have the opportunity to learn lessons right now the easy way during training instead of the hard way during a potential battle. So personally, I've seen an increase in mountain training at the unit level. I see soldiers, especially guard soldiers who have the free time, go out and climb and ski and hike or shoot competitions on the weekends on their own, because you don't need to be doing these things in uniform to get the benefit of doing them. All right, now to wrap this up, this isn't a doom and gloom talk. I think the last 5 years, the Army as a whole has gotten better at a lot of things, including mountaineering. We have a brand new schoolhouse, updated courseware. There's been a lot of cross-training with other countries in the Alps, the Baltics, Caucasus, South America. And in the future, I'd like to compile some of those lessons learned in one place. Maybe this is the platform to do it, we'll see. So share this with anyone who you think would enjoy this talk. Let me know your thoughts. And if you'd like some help on setting up any sort of training or need some ideas for training, feel free to reach out. Thanks for listening.